This channel is supported by Truefire. Truefire is an online library
enough, you can get the Truefire All Access Pass for as cheap as they ever do it, the $99 thing. So just jump and do that if you're looking for the best price you can get Truefire All Access for. Vintage guitars, to me, present an interesting set of problems, and I wanted to discuss whilst I've got access to this wonderful, I think it's a 1968 Gibson SG Special. This belongs to Francisco. I did try to include some of Francisco's amazing playing in a video where he was playing a classical guitar that he made himself, but unfortunately YouTube recognized what he was playing. So here's like footage of it, but I can't show you the audio because copyright and that, and I don't want to have to make a Beato video.
That's beautiful.
Oh!
Is that beautiful? What?
Anyway, so the problem, as I see it with vintage guitars, we'll get into it. I guess the main problem is, to me, that I think a lot of people think that this is maybe overhyped and maybe there's an element of cork sniffery around this. But if you manage to get your hands on a good vintage example, I do think you might find that you would be surprised at just how much people like Tom Bukovac and folks that are, you know, Joe Bonamassa, that they seem to be actually quite correct about a lot of what they say about these vintage guitars. Francisco happened across this, I think it was pretty much a beta guitar at that point, and it had been painted black. So this has been restored. Whoever has owned it over its sort of, 5 decades of play has played it a lot. So the fretboard is essentially sort of scalloped looking, and this is one thing that I've never seen. People obviously create relics, which we'll talk about a little bit. I've never seen anyone really do this kind of work that actually gets a guitar to look more like an old guitar, particularly rosewood, where it doesn't. That's the number one thing that I see in rosewood guitars. The few examples that I've seen that have really been played for sort of 4 or 5 decades, you get these indentations, and it's kind of lovely, and it actually reminds me of like when you see something like a well-used wooden worktop or something like that, where it's like clearly this thing has been subjected to a life. Like there's really pretty incredible scalloping over here at like the whatever fret this is, 15th. So someone was playing in E minor on this thing. Yeah, I think Nacho's, for example, are pretty good replications of Ware, but even his fretboards don't seem to me to be quite the same. Now, here's the thing, like, is it hype or not? I think there's an element of this stuff which is maybe the case that I've not played enough vintage guitars to really know that whether this is hype or not, but the ones that I have played, so recently I played Ed Alesco's 53 Gold Top, one of the best guitars I've ever played. This SG, one of the best guitars I've ever played. I've played a vintage Strat, which I was not as fussed with. I'm sure that there's, examples that go across the whole gamut of stuff, right? And that is kind of, guitars at this period of time were apparently more variable. You'd have had, no/less CNC involved. Been no CNC at this point, surely. It wasn't a computer, was there? Obviously. So, whereas today, even like your Murphy Labs and all that sort of stuff, even the Nachos, like, those are CNC creations. So, like, there's a level of consistency to guitars today. And again, people say that guitars that are made today are better and that these guitars are made wrong. I don't know. You try them for yourself, and I don't think there are many people that would kind of conclude that these guitars were made wrong. In my opinion, someone who might say that to you might be trying to sell you a guitar, whether it's a PRS or whether it's a Chapman guitar or whatever. If someone's telling me that guitars, from this era are made wrong, I frankly don't really believe them, because they're great guitars. The ones that I've played, maybe some of them are not. So that's one problem. Like, there's a lot of hype. The second problem is the price. So obviously for most people these are not going to be affordable unless they're in sort of what they call like player grade condition, like this one would have been like a restoration product. But even at this point, like if you buy like a player grade guitar from somewhere reputable like ATB Guitars or wherever you are in the States, like those now are like really expensive instruments. And then this gets to the real problem to me, which is like, how can someone who's not an expert in this field buy a vintage guitar or even like dip their toe into this water without fear of getting quite badly burned, because I think it was like 2007 or something like that. I saw that Ed Roman had talked about, he'd gone to Japan and there was like a room of like people creating replica vintage instruments and like counterfeit instruments. That's back in 2007 when, you know, things were not anywhere near as crazy as they are now in terms of like the vintage market has continued to go up and up and up. I'm sure there must be like a lot of counterfeit instruments out there, and how do you avoid that when you think like anyone can watch a YouTube video with some of the experts talking about this stuff, you know, and you can find the information more freely today than you could in 2007 about what makes a vintage guitar and the things that people are looking for, the experts. So I don't know how exactly you would go about being really confident that you'd got yourself a guitar that was not problematic and that actually was what it says it is. Yeah. So that's kind of a big problem for me, and the main thing where I just feel like I could never really be comfortable going into that sort of thing, because I just know that whoever's counterfeiting these things is going to have at least probably as much knowledge as me. And this was one of the things that the Bukovac and Bonamassa and Robert Baker got in a room. They were comparing like a Gibson to a modern day Les Paul Standard, which is not really the thing that I'm worried about, because, you know, a Les Paul Standard made today is not fetching a massive amount of money, whereas, you know, vintage Gibsons actually are, and those are the ones that you presume that people are doing a better job potentially of counterfeiting if they're going to try that sort of thing. Anyway, so that's kind of that. The next thing is like, because of that huge value, like, would you actually be comfortable taking this guitar? Like, so obviously Francisco's trusted me with this, but, you know, like it's becomes like a part of the family, right? And the other thing, like, I've heard Joe Bonamassa talk about how pots back in this day were made differently. Like, this is the other problem, that I don't believe that, like, these builders back then were any more skilled than potentially what we've got today. But they did have access to materials that are different to today's. So these pots and stuff, like this hardware, particular like electronic pots, you know, Bonamassa says they were simply made differently. The other thing is like the wood, which is, you know, realistically, they're not building guitars particularly with Brazilian rosewood anymore, because that's, you know, protected, and the mahogany as well. And then it's the other thing that back in the day, like, these were from, you know, sources that were much more mature than they are today, right? Because they were just not built at the scale that guitars are built today. And that's the thing for me as well, which is like, they were made in a different time, and, you know, they're never making more of them. And the things that are being made today, I think, are more sort of, you know, straight off the shelf. And I don't think the Murphy Lab stuff, to me, seems to be all that close, really, when you actually see like a vintage guitar. Particularly, in my opinion, it's more like you've given a new piece of wood and some new pickups and stuff. You've given them like a superficial going over, and they're nice, great guitars in many cases, but just not the same thing. And I think that is the problem, and that's why it's kind of, I think, kind of alluring. And there's something so awesome about a guitar like this, which has clearly got a story. I think time is the thing. Time, and someone spending time, like, well, lots of people over the years spending time on this. I think this was refretted by the, I think it was the Chilean like head of Taylor. Anyway, like, this guitar has clearly lived a life. Even before Francisco got it, it doesn't have like some of the crazy wear and stuff because it's a refinish. But it's still quite clearly, you know, and also there's something so sleek about it versus the more modern SGs that I see, which kind of look a little bit on the blocky side, and certainly Tokai copies that I've seen very much like thick chunks of wood, like in plasticky seeming finish, whereas this just doesn't have that. It's like a really sleek, sporty kind of thing, in my opinion. I don't know, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Is it all bollocks? Could be. There's lots of non-original parts on this, but yeah, I totally see why, you know, once you played a vintage guitar, maybe you'd be not wanting to go back.